When Paul lost his wife Emma to a tragic accident, his world fell apart. They had been married for years, living a quiet life in a small town. Emma was everything to Paul, his partner, his confidant, and his rock. Without her, the days seemed unbearably long, and the house felt hollow. Paul, a retired military mechanic with a small disability pension, did his best to keep going. The routines of fixing things around the house and tending to his modest garden gave him some purpose. But loneliness was a heavy burden. It was Emma's aunt, Margaret, who planted the idea of moving on. "Paul," she said one evening, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder, "Emma wouldn't want you to be alone forever. You're still young. There are plenty of good women out there who would appreciate a man like you." He wasn't sure. The thought of someone else felt like a betrayal, but Margaret was persistent. "There's a woman, Sophie," she said. "She's kind, a hard worker, and she's been through her own hardships. Why don't you meet her?" Sophie was a woman of contrasts, warm and friendly on the surface, but with a sharp wit and a glint of mischief in her eyes. When Paul met her, she seemed like the fresh start Margaret had promised. After a few months of tentative courtship, Sophie moved into Paul's house. She quickly took charge of the household, cooking meals, planting flowers, and even repairing old furniture. It seemed like a match made in heaven, and Paul began to feel like he could breathe again. But there were rules. Paul made them clear from the start. "No drinking," he said firmly, "and I expect loyalty. If we're going to make this work, we have to respect each other." Sophie agreed without hesitation. For a while, life was good. They fell into a rhythm, with Paul working part-time at a nearby repair shop, and Sophie handling the house. But, slowly, cracks began to show. The two friends always made time for their side hustle skills. It started subtly. Paul would come home from work and notice the faint smell of alcohol on Sophie's breath. "I was just having a drink with Lily," she said one day, referring to a neighbor whose husband worked out of town. "It's nothing, Paul. Don't make a big deal out of it." Paul frowned, but let it slide. Then, the housework began to slip. Sophie spent more and more time with Lily, and Paul often returned to find dishes unwashed and laundry piling up. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Paul decided to check on his old workshop. He hadn't touched it in weeks and wanted to ensure everything was in order. That's when he saw the truck tracks. He began to hunt. Almost at sunrise, they turned to the right. They led directly to the back of the property, near the garden shed. Paul's chest tightened. He followed the tracks and found empty bottles scattered around the shed. The thought of Sophie and Lily drinking together didn't bother him as much as what came next. He found footprints. 2 sets of them. One set was unmistakably Sophie's. The other was larger, belonging to a man. The next day, Paul went to see his old friend Victor, a retired cop who had a knack for sniffing out trouble. "Victor, I need your help," Paul said. "Something's not right with Sophie." Victor raised an eyebrow. "What do you think is going on?" Paul hesitated. "I think she's meeting someone when I'm not around." Victor sighed. "Paul, you've got to be sure before you confront her. Let's set up a camera." They installed a discreet camera near the garden shed. Paul felt uneasy, as though he was betraying Sophie's trust, but he needed to know the truth. A few days later, Victor handed Paul the footage. What he saw broke him. Sophie wasn't just meeting another man, she was inviting him into their home. When Paul confronted her, Sophie didn't even try to deny it. "I'm sorry, Paul," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Paul's voice was cold. "Get out." Sophie packed her bags and left that evening, but the betrayal haunted Paul. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the life he thought they were building together. Victor, ever the practical one, offered Paul a lifeline. "Paul, you've got to start fresh," he said. "There's a place in the city looking for a groundskeeper. It comes with housing. You'd be perfect for it." Paul took his friend's advice. Within a month, he had sold the house and moved to the city. In the city, Paul met Clara, a single mother of two who worked as a nurse. She was kind, hard-working, and fiercely independent. Slowly they grew close, bonding over their shared love of simple pleasures like gardening and cooking. For the first time in years, Paul felt like he had found a partner who truly valued him. Clara's children adored him, and he found himself smiling more often than he ever thought possible. "So you are here finally," he said. As for Sophie, she stayed in the small town, her life spiraling downward. Word spread quickly about her affair, and she lost the respect of the community. Last Paul heard, she was living in a run-down trailer, surviving on the kindness of strangers. Paul learned a valuable lesson from it all. Trust is fragile, and once broken, it's nearly impossible to repair. But life has a way of offering second chances to those willing to take them. And Paul? He grabbed his with both hands, never looking back.